Hi there, this is Jeanette, and welcome to day 2 of my Christmas series for 2017. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some shadow box cards. Now I created the shadow boxes using Fawn's new die set, and it comes with the die to create the shadow box, as well as several options for openings, as well as those landscape sort of snowbanks that you see in the back. For the images, I used Very Happy Holidays, so that first shadow box, and this shadow box used that stamp set. It's a set that's full of sweet little polar bears. And then for my third shadow box, I turned the shadow box on its side. I used it a little differently, and I used the Winter Otter set to create this one. So in my video, I'm going to be sharing how I stamped out the images, how I colored them with Zig markers, and then how I put the shadow boxes together. So we'll get started now, and I'll take you through the process. So here are the sets that I pulled out to use for this project. I'm going to be coloring the images with Zig markers, so I'm stamping everything out on Strathmore Bristol watercolor paper, and I'm using archival black ink from Ranger. This ink is perfect for watercoloring. So I'm placing the stamp sets. I'm not putting all of them at the same time because I find you don't get such a great impression if you stamp too many of them. And as it is, I am having to stamp the images a couple of times. This is the first time I'm using the stamps, so a couple of times to stamp them out is usually what works best, and that's why I like to use my MISTI because it's super easy. In between, I am washing or cleaning my stamps with a baby wipe and replacing them right back onto the acetate so that I don't lose them. There's a lot of little stamps in these sets, and I want to make sure I don't misplace anything. I was really thrilled when I saw this one set, the Very Happy Holidays, because it has so many different elements in it that I knew it would lend itself to creating so many different types of cards. So here I'm coloring my bear. I'm listing the Zig markers that I'm using on the screen as I'm using them. So I did put that lighter gray down, and now I'm going to deepen those shadows, and what I did is I put a little bit of the marker, I sort of scrubbed it on that little mounting block, and I'm just picking up the ink and putting it down onto the paper. So I find this is a great way to color the polar bear. It makes certain that you don't sort of overcolor the polar bear and he ends up looking sort of dirty or too gray. So this was the best way I found to do it, that you lay down your lighter color and then just add little bits of the darker color directly onto the paper with your paintbrush. So you can see that he has a little bit of definition there, but he still is looking white. I'm going to let him dry before I work on him any further, and I'm just going to go ahead and do the rest of the polar bears. So this is a really sort of fast way to color. If you stamp everything out that you're using and then you color like items together, it sort of makes the coloring time a little bit shorter. You'll see that I did stamp the back part of that skater, so that image comes in two parts. You have the front of the skater and the back of the skater, and this lets you sort of color them and put them together, and then you can have a spinning component on your card or shadow box. And that's what I thought I was going to do originally. In the end, I decided I was going to do that for an insert page for my December daily album, so I'll be sharing that with you maybe later on this month. So I'm still coloring the bears. I did, for this first bear, color it exactly the same as I had colored the other three. And then for the second little baby bear, I decided to make him just a little bit darker. And so I didn't put any of that light gray on. I went directly to the dark gray ink just to make him a little bit different from his brother or sister, his sibling, I guess. And so those are almost all done. And now the first images that I colored are going to be dry, so I can put in some cheek color. So you see again, I just scrubbed a little bit of that cheek color onto my acrylic block, and I'm picking it up, putting it where the cheeks are, and then just softening it a little bit. I don't like having like a harsh circle where the cheeks are. I really like to sort of blend it out a little bit. So I'm going to do that for all of the bears, a little bit of cheek color there. And then I will be doing the scarf for the bear. And I really wanted this nice sort of teal color. I knew I was going to be using paper from the new paper pack, and it's all shades of like aqua and sort of gold, and I knew I wanted to use the aqua shades, so I wanted to match the scarf to the paper. Here I'm using a couple of colors and then creating the sort of light by fading away the color and then removing a little bit with my paintbrush. So that's a good way to create shadows and light. You can actually remove a little of the paint with your paintbrush. Coloring in the skates now. I used a very dark blue for that. I'm going to start with this little pail. Now these images are so cute and they're a little bit tiny, so that's why I really love using these Zig marker brushes, because they have such a fine tip to them. You can really be very precise when you're adding the color, and if you use a fine paintbrush as well, you should have no problem creating your shading. Coloring the sort of ice here. I just love that all these components are going to be mixed and matched with other sets from Lawn Fawn. Really the possibilities start to be endless. You can create your own very unique card and personalize it to the person that you're going to be sending it to. For sure, I have little fishermen in my family, so when I saw the fishing rod and these polar bears, I knew it would be perfect for my hubby and my sons. They'll appreciate these little shadow box cards. So that was the, I guess, ice fishing hole. Now I'm just going to color the fish pretty quick. I'm not using my paintbrush. I'm just blending that darker color with the lighter yellow. It goes very quickly. And because it's such a fine tip, I don't have to worry about going outside the lines. Now I'm just checking out a couple of colors of red before I commit to which one I'm using for the bow on the fish. And then I'll just go ahead and use that darker color on the candy cane. When I'm creating sets, I try to keep the sort of number of shades or number of markers I'm using to a minimum so that everything sort of matches. Just coloring the fishing rod, and then I zoomed in so that you could see me coloring the otter. So I'm outlining with my darker marker and then just blending that color with the lighter marker, leaving sort of a circle there in the center so that I can take my paintbrush that is slightly damp and then just blend away. And you can wipe off the excess color on a paper towel and you get a really beautiful graduated shadow. So here I'm a little bit off screen. I apologize for that. That's the problem when you zoom in. Sometimes I don't check my viewfinder and I'm coloring away and I don't have the footage to show you. You can see a little bit here where I'm coloring and just blending it out. So every time my hand goes off screen, that's me wiping the color off on my paper towel. Of course, the coloring is sped up so that it doesn't take forever for you to watch, but just want to point out these tiny things that maybe you don't notice. So now I'm going to color in the scarf using the same technique, starting with my dark, blending with the lighter, and then using my paintbrush to do the final blend. So now that everything is colored, I am going to start die cutting everything. I'm just darkening the eyes here and the nose on each of the critters with a black pen. And now I'm going to do my die cutting. So I did have to snip all these apart. This was the first time I was using it, so I used these wire cutters to snip them apart. And I do like to try to die cut as many of the components at the same time. So when I'm stamping the images, I try to space them a little bit further apart so that I can get as many positioned on the paper at one time. I use a magnetic plate underneath, and I use some post-it tape to hold the dies really securely on the paper so that they don't shift while I'm die cutting. Now, to create the shadow box card itself, this is the die you use, and you need to cut 2 per shadow box. So I'm using some aqua paper, I just cut some gray paper, and so you just have to cut 2 per card. And then there are 2 rectangles of different sizes and an oval that you can use to create the aperture or the opening for your shadow box. So I did use that larger rectangle for 2 of them, and then for the gray paper where the otter is going to be, I'm going to be using the oval, and I did make sure that my sentiment that I wanted to stamp on the front was going to fit. So I made sure that I was putting the oval in the right place before I die cut it. So now I am going to be cutting the hills for the polar bear shadow boxes, and for the water, for the otter, I'm going to be using some blue vellum. I found that in my stash. I was really happy to see it. So I'm going to be embossing with white powder the sentiment on the front of this shadow box card. So I'm lining everything up with my Misty. I decided that it was probably easier to line up the first 2 and then put the third one on. Once everything was exactly where I wanted it to be, I swung that arm down. I used an anti-static bag and my Versamark to stamp it. And now I am sprinkling some white embossing powder over top. I'll shake off the excess, and then I will just take my heat tool and melt that down. So there you can see it all completed. You need to do this step before you actually fold and create your shadow box, otherwise it becomes a little bit difficult. So you can see there are some fold lines on the die cut, so you need to sort of fold them, and I like to use my bone folder to press down to make sure they're nice and crisp. I did the same thing for the aqua ones here, and now I'm just starting to put some score pal tape. This tape adheres pretty strongly. I don't want these things to fall apart, so that's why I used it. So you just sort of butt them up against each other like this, and then just fold down the tab. And before you do the sort of close it on the other side, you need to position your snowbanks. So I had to play around a little bit, trying to figure out exactly where I wanted them to be. So then once you have one side done, I'm just checking that it's going to work. You just fold everything flat, and here I'm sort of moving it again. The first time you do it, you do have to play around with it a little bit, and then once you sort of get the knack of it, it goes faster. So now I can just fold that over, press it down, and they are adhered to the exact right spot in the shadow box. So you can see I lined everything up, and now it's all adhered together, and you're able to fold it down flat. Now for this one, I'm using the shadow box really not in the way it's meant to be used. So the water that I cut on the vellum, I won't have any sides to adhere it to, so I did cut off the sort of tabbed edges. I cut it down to size, and I'm just going to adhere it to the inside part of my shadow box like this. So I'm just trying to get the release paper off my score pal tape here. and you can see that I'm just trimming it down to size, and I'll layer the two pieces over on top of each other. The other thing I did was I took that die again and I did cut it with some aqua paper, and I folded it, and I'm putting it on the inside of this shadow box so that I have some blue in the background. It makes it look a little bit more like there's sky and there's water. And I'm tucking the little otter between the two sheets of vellum, and he'll be holding his little candy cane. I'm going to be using this Nouveau glue. Been using this for a while now, and it works so well. I'm using my tweezers for the tiny little pieces here, and I just put a mounting block over top them for some weight while they're drying, and I never have any problems with things falling off my cards. So you can see that's the first one done. Now for the other shadow boxes, you sort of have to fold them and unfold them to make sure that when you're sticking your components down, they're going to end up sort of looking the way you want them to look. It wasn't so difficult with this little skater because there's just the one figure and the ice. And I did take that die and just cut out that portion that's going to be on the back. It's just easier than trying to measure and cut. And you can see how that just fits in perfectly. And now for this one, you do have to, or I did have to, play around with it a little bit to make sure that things could be seen when it was unfolded. So the first thing I did was put that water hole down, and then the bear that's fishing, get him down. And again, I'm using that same glue from Tonic. It's amazing. Putting that fishing pole, I'm trying to sort of put it so that it looks like he's holding it and the line is dropping into the water. So I did end up cutting a little bit there just so that it looks like it's disappearing into the water hole. And then I started positioning where I wanted the little baby bears to be. And again, you can see I'm folding it and unfolding it to make sure that it's going to look exactly how I want it to look when it's upright. And this was so much fun to make, and I have to say I think I'm going to have to make a whole bunch of new ones because everybody loves them. They're so fun. So for the sentiment, I used another die set. It's an older one. I'll leave links to it. I die cut the banner first, popped it into the negative space with some post-it tape at the back to hold it securely, and then I was able to position my stamp right over where it needed to be, and using my MISTI stamp it. So I hope that makes sense. It's just I find a little easier when there's very little room for error. There's like not a whole lot of space. It's easier to die cut, sort of tape them into the paper, position your stamp over top, and then it stamps perfectly. So for one of them, I decided to put it on the top of the shadow box. So for this skater bear here, and then for the other one, I put it on the bottom. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed seeing me create these shadow box cards. They're so much fun to make. I think people are going to enjoy receiving them in the mail. I have a full list of all the supplies with links on my blog, or you can check below this video. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for more videos in this series.